We will be discussing the Scottsboro boys. On March 25th, 1939, 9 African-American teenage boys were accused of raping 2 white women while boarding a Southern Railroad freight train in northern Alabama. Here are their stories.
Eugene Williams was only 13 years old when he was arrested. He was one of the youngest of the 9 black boys who were forcefully taken from the train as he was leaving his home for the first time. He had been working as a dishwasher at a Chattanooga, Tennessee cafe before he hopped onto the train. Willie Robertson was born in Columbus, Georgia. His mother had died when he was 2, and he was raised by his grandmother. Willie had many conditions. He suffered from asthma and had severe syphilis to the point where he could barely walk. Charles, or Charlie Weems, was the oldest of the Scottsboro boys. His mother died when he was 4, and 6 of his 7 siblings had passed away when they were young. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade to try and support his family by working in a pharmacy after his father became sick. He was sent to live with an aunt in Riverdale, Georgia, but dropped out of school again to look for work. He was on his way to see family in Tennessee when he hopped on the train.
Haywood Patterson was born in Elberton, Georgia. He was devoted to his parents and mainly close to his mother. He dropped out of school in the 3rd grade to work as a delivery boy. With his parents having so many children to feed, Haywood ate his meals away from home as much as possible, and having to leave his home at 14, he hopped freight trains frequently to seek work. Olin Montgomery was born in Monroe, Georgia in 1913. His parents divorced, and him and his mother lived on $1.50 a week. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade to help his mother and to find work. He was blind in one eye due to cataract, and Olin left his home to travel to Memphis and find a job.
Clarence Norris was born in 1912. His parents had 11 children and were sharecroppers in Warm Springs, Georgia. His father had been a slave and told us stories of his life during slavery. Clarence dropped out of school after 1st grade to help his family with the crops. He began working for wages after his father died. After his girlfriend left him, he headed to the railroad tracks. He was going to Sheffield, Alabama to visit his aunt and find work. Ozzie Powell was born in rural Georgia. He had only 1 year of school and could barely write his name. He was raised by his mother and stepfather and began working hard labor jobs at the age of 13. He ran away at 14 years old and started boarding trains to find a job.
Andrew, or Andy Wright, was born and raised in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He dropped out of school in 6th grade after his dad died to try and help support his mother, Ada, and his younger siblings. He heard about a government job, and he went with his younger brother Roy to Memphis, Tennessee. They did not tell their mother where they were going when they hopped on the train. Leroy, or Roy Wright, was one of the youngest Scottsboro boys. He went to school for 4 years before he dropped out in order to work at a grocery store. When he hopped on the train with his brother Andy, it was his first time being away from home.
By the 1930s, the country was devastated by the Great Depression, leaving many unemployed Americans to try and hitch rides aboard freight trains moving across the country in search of work. On March 25, 1931, the Southern Railroad freight train was headed bound towards Memphis, Tennessee from northern Alabama.
9 African-American teenagers, Haywood Patterson, Olin Montgomery, Clarence Norris, Willie Robertson, Andy Wright, Ozzie Powell, Eugene Williams, Charlie Weems, and Roy Wright were all searching for work when a racially charged fight broke out between the passengers.
The fight was believed to happen when a young white man stepped on the hands of one of the Scottsboro boys, which forced the young white men who were fighting to exit the train. Infuriated, the white men told the station master that several black youths have been throwing them off the train after a fight.
Once the train reached Paint Rock, Alabama, the Scottsboro boys were met by an angry mob and arrested only with a minor charge, which was assault. The police also began to question Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, the 2 white women who were also aboard the freight train.
The 2 women realized that they are going to be faced charges of vagrancy and illegal sexual activity, leading for them to falsely accuse the boys of rape in order to avoid these charges. This led to the 9 boys being transferred to the local county seat in Scottsboro to await trial.
The trial began on April 6th. The 9 boys were each charged with rape and had about 10,000 spectators watching the trials, with armed soldiers keeping the crowd at bay.
With a lynch mob outside the jail, an all-white jury was assembled and resulted in a hung jury. Judge Hawkins very quickly declares a mistrial and sentences the 8 boys to death by electric chair.
The trial of the other boy, the youngest of the 9, 13-year-old Leroy Wright, ended in a hung jury, in which he was to face life imprisonment instead of death.
A mistrial was then declared, in which he would face imprisonment until the final verdict of his co-defendants. Ruby Bates was born in Huntsville, Alabama in 1913. She died in Yakima, Washington on October 27, 1976.
Victoria Price was born on April 27, 1962, in Fayetteville, Tennessee. She died in Huntsville Hospital at 77 years old.
Victoria Price was the main prosecution witness, as Ruby Bates had been previously missing for most of the trials. Price had testified that the young black youths had thrown the white boys off the train and had gang raped the both of them.
Yet, they provided inconsistent accounts of various details of these incidents. Plus, the testimony provided by the examining doctors raised serious doubts on whether the girls were actually raped.
The prosecution's case grew stronger with each trial, as previously unhelped witnesses were dropped and the alleged victim's story grew stronger after each trial. Plus, several of the other defendants also testified inconsistently.
Yet the state's case against the defense grew weaker, as the defendants did not incriminate each other on cross-examination. The women were less certain in identifying them as the rapists, one of the defendants being blind, and the other had several cases of venereal diseases that would determine raping a woman to be difficult. Nonetheless, the jury had still convicted them to death sentences.
In November 1932, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Powell versus the state of Alabama that the defendants were not provided adequate counsel and sufficient time to prepare for their case by the state of Alabama, violating their 14th Amendment right to due process.
The Supreme Court had overturned the verdicts, setting a legal precedent for enforcing the right of African Americans to adequate counsel.
In March 1933, the boys were given new trials in Decatur, Alabama. The case gained nationwide attention and was reported in newspapers all around the world. High-profile New York lawyer Sam Leibowitz served as an attorney for the boys' appeals.
Leibowitz challenged Victoria Price's version of events by calling a physician as a witness, who explained that the physical examination of the girls suggested that they were not raped. By then, Ruby Bates, who had previously been missing, recanted her testimony and testified for defendants.
She admitted that the girls made up the charges to avoid being arrested for vagrancy. Even with the admission of Price and Bates falsifying their allegations, the jury still held 7 of the 8 convictions.
Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, thousands march in Washington, D.C. to protest the trials in support of the defendants.
January 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the guilty verdicts as rulings in Norris v. State of Alabama stated that the systematic exclusion of African Americans from jury pools denied a fair trial to defendants. This violated the Sixth Amendment right, which is a right to a fair trial.
This case would help integrate future juries across the nation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and other civil rights groups joined the International Labor Defense that year from the Scottsboro Defense Committee, which reorganized the defense effort for the Scottsboro boys' next set of retrials. On April 1, 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the new convictions.
After the 1936 ruling, the boys were each tried again, convicted, and served more time in prison. Despite 2 Supreme Court rulings in their favor, the Scottsboro boys each served 5 to 20 years in prison for crimes they did not commit.
Patterson escaped from prison in 1948 and fled to Detroit. He had been arrested by the FBI a few years later, but he was not expected to go to Alabama. After a violent bar fight, he had been sentenced to prison again, where he died of cancer at 39 years old.
Clarence Norris was the last survivor of the Scottsboro boys' case. He died on Monday at the age of 76 in the Bronx Community Hospital after suffering from an illness.
Roy Wright served in the Army. In 1959, he was returning home from the sea and found his wife at the home of another man. He killed her and went back to his apartment and then shot himself. In October 1937, Weems had tuberculosis and stayed in the prison's hospital. In March of the year after, a prison mill foreman had mistaken his identity and stabbed him with a knife. In 1937, Andy got tuberculosis. In 1938, he was stabbed by a prison guard who had mistaken him for another inmate.
Robinson's had asthma and was very aggravated in his time in jail. He later died of an asthma attack.
And after 82 years in 2013, the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles issued posthumous pardons to 3 of the boys, Patterson, Weems, and Andy Wright, bringing an end to the most notorious case of racial injustice in U.S. history.
The Scottsboro case is an especially important case when understanding the systematic structure of racism which is seen within our country.
The case of the Scottsboro boys highlighted the beginnings of the civil rights movement and led to 2 landmark Supreme Court rulings which established important rights for criminal defendants.
These Supreme Court verdicts had also helped fuel the civil rights movement. Even authors like Harper Lee and Richard Wright drew on the boys' experience for books like To Kill a Mockingbird and Native Son, respectively. Over the years, this case was used in other trials as well, such as the Central Park 9.
In 1989, the Central Park Five, Raymond Santana, Andren McCrae, Yusuf Salam, and Corey Wise were all accused and charged with rape and the assault of the young woman Trisha Maley in New York City, despite not being at the scene of the crime and despite the boys not knowing each other prior to the incident.
Under coercion, the boys confessed to the crime to receive lesser sentences, and they were convicted despite the lack of evidence against them. The young boys spent about 5 to almost 15 years in jail for a crime they did not commit, having one of the boys at age 16 being tried as an adult.
The case spurred nationwide attention and talks of racial injustice. The boys were wrongly convicted, and after the case was reopened, they discovered that the DNA of the boys did not match any of the evidence found at the crime scene. In 2002, they were extradited, had all the charges withdrawn, and were compensated for the time they lost and spent in prison for a crime they were wrongly convicted for.
Despite their stories being 50 years apart, the Scottsboro boys and the Central Park Five cases were undoubtedly similar, as even newspapers had showcased the Central Park Five to be the Scottsboro boys of their own generation. Both cases featured the villainization and the animalism of black men as they were showcased to be assaulting white women, presenting them to be a danger to society.
The cases, despite being decades apart, had managed to showcase the racial injustices and the corruption present in the justice system, as well as the discrimination and blatant racism against people of color, especially black men in America.
The Scottsboro defendants were eventually saved from execution, but they stayed in prison for many years. Even after they were released, they never fully recovered from their trauma. Their story has justly been known as an American tragedy. The case of the Scottsboro boys lasted more than 80 years and was a turning point in the birth of a national civil rights movement.
Cases like the Scottsboro Boys and the Central Park Five were important nationwide cases which set up a legal precedent for future African American defendants and revealed the corruption of the legal justice system. Their case had also led to 2 landmark Supreme Court rulings which established major rights for criminal defendants. It was also a major turning point for the rights of criminal defendants, as it was the first time that defendants facing the death penalty were constitutionally authorized to appointed counsel if they couldn't supply one, and the right to counsel incorporates the right to effective representation. The trials helped show the issues with all-white juries and was seen as a main example of racial bias within the legal system.
The Scottsboro Boys was a tragic case. It established 2 of the most important legal precedents and birthed a national movement calling for the equality of African Americans. But until then, this case is solved. Let's know what you want to see next time.